Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, a resource center for Jewish engagement. Scholar Circle is one of our programs. Today's Scholar Circle features Dr. Asaf Romirowsky on the purpose of higher education, the crisis facing America campuses. In addition to our work with Scholar Circle, Chai Mitzvah's mission is to increase Jewish engagement through small group learning. We have over 20 discussion guides geared towards meaningful and intimate conversation around Jewish text. We especially like to work with synagogues, JCCs, and federations. To date, over 9,000 people have participated in our programs, and we have worked with over 700 legacy organizations. Please visit our website and contact us to learn more about how to reignite your Jewish learning and increase engagement in these important organizations. Please go to chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored the best-selling book Conspiracy U, A Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. Scholar Circle has engaged over 6,000 participants since 10/7 from around the world. The Scholar Circle program hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email within 1 week. Thank you to our recent donors and also to our annual sponsor, the University of Connecticut, through the Laboratory for the Study and Prevention of Global Antisemitism. We welcome audience questions anytime. Please use the Zoom Q&A box. Scholar Circle program is a program of Chai Mitzvah, a 501c3 non-for-profit organization. Please consider supporting Scholar Circle with a donation, which is fully tax deductible. Dr. Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. Asaf is also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a professor at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London, UK, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israel and Zionist history. Asaf is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestinian Refugee Relief and a contributor to A Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel. His latest book is entitled October 7th, The War Over Words and Deeds. Asaf's publicly engaged scholarship has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest, the American Interest, the New Republic, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Ynet and Tablet, and many other outlets. Welcome, Asaf.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, you're on.
I'm on. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Audrey. I appreciate the hospitality. Thank you and Simon, and thank you for Chai Mitzvah for giving me the privilege of being here again. I think I've spoken here before. My comments tonight are going to focus on some of what we discussed or I addressed in my latest book that Audrey kindly mentioned, October 7th, The War Over Words and Deeds. And really, part of the impetus for this project or the book that, that I worked on with my colleague Donna Devine was really how the academy, higher education at large, was asphyxiated by knowledge, and which is obviously an anathema to what higher education should be about, but really why, in many ways, and has to do with the larger agenda of how 10/7, caught, not only the Israelis by surprise, but also a lot of what was been happening in the United States for decades, I would argue, as it relates to knowledge of understanding what the oppositional forces are, and how all of this really came about. Try to explain some of this in the time that I have tonight. I know we're short on time, but I'll try to give a little bit of an understanding of what this is all about and how this played out at large. So I'll share a little bit here as far as some information that I believe is relevant to what we do and why it's important, I think, to look at the importance of these issues. So if you look at the role of the university, which I think is is absolutely critical, and this is a quote by my friend and colleague who's the former president of more American universities that I'm aware of, Professor President Gordon Gee, who was a president not only of places like Brown, West Virginia, Vanderbilt, and other places, but the absolute question of what is the mission of universities at large, and really why are we trying, and what the goal of these institutions are supposed to be. Ultimately, I would say that the role of the university, if you go back generations, and higher education was to, create inquisitive research, to create, actual seeking of truth, not the kind of globalist narrative that is put out there as far as trying to solve the problems of the world, but actually try to understand what the problems are, trying to, understand patterns of behavior and trying to learn from those issues. There's been a kind of a thinning or kind of an understanding of what the mantra of these universities is supposed to be. But inquisitive research, I would argue, and intellectual integrity and scholarship has deteriorated. And we're just about to mark, obviously, now 9/11, the 25th anniversary of 9/11, and really how things have gone, I would argue, downhill in many ways. I would argue that up until the 1990s, early 2000s, if you looked at syllabi in American institutions, there would be much more of a balance. People were trained to actually, do what they were supposed to do as far as scholars, the idea of veritas, the idea of seeking for truth, that's out the door. You look at syllabi today, they are entirely, I would argue, falling on the lines of propaganda rather than actual scholarship. Topics that are being used or being given the semblance of courses are are basically monolithic and propaganda at large. They're not about scholarship, and they're going into these cosmetic issues that really are going to theories that mean nothing. And the scholars, in some of these so-called scholars, I would argue, who are teaching these topics, are less concerned about providing skill set and balance for their students about what actually is going on the ground, but why trying to actually indoctrinate them with their own propaganda. What I have observed, and what many of us who've been looking at the role of higher education at large, I think much of this has to do with, been a subterfuge or more of a Marxist-Leninist tactic, a theory known as entryism, of basically trying to hijack the institutions by trying to take them over, giving the semblance of working together, but actually having a much more nefarious way of doing business, which is what, similar, the kind of the Trotsky way of doing business as far as entryism was basically trying to insert the French Socialist Party or, Trotskyite groups, back in the 70s were able to take over the Labor Party and push them out before the 1980s. I mean, there are these different kind of political movements that have ruled or kind of used these tactics. Well, we've seen in American higher education, and this is, I think, part of the battlefront that was lost or more or less misunderstood, is basically how groups like the Muslim Brotherhood were able to infiltrate and buy American institutions through the use of what, we call the use of soft powers. So education, higher education, media, to create a very distinct narrative that would allow the institutions to be taken over and basically hijack the narrative at large. So case in point, and by the way, just to, I'd be remiss if I did not mention this tactic of trying to infiltrate or hijack the institutions is a Soviet tactic that was later on adopted by the PLO, and took a lot of gained a lot of traction, I would argue, post 1967. But much of the words that we talk about and much of what what I addressed in this volume about October 7th emanated also from a previous project that I was part of known as Word Crimes, that basically dissected many of the words that have hijacked the Arab-Israeli conflict, where there's no debate. All you have to say is one phrase, whether it's colonialism, indigeneity, settler colonialism, right of return, or any other kind of phrases that basically have connoted the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict without going into actual context. Context, is overrated. Clearly in higher education because they don't need to explain, as to use these catchphrases. These catchphrases that I'm talking about were not just catchphrases. These were phrases that were chosen by design and tested by the KGB about words that would resonate with Western liberal society in order for them to basically seem like they are indeed liberal and progressive and open and Western, but really what they are is a way to overtake an entire agenda. And so topics like resistance, and liberalism and social justice, how these terms have been manipulated and used and instituted and codified inside higher education as part of what the Soviets were able to do. Did it, back in the 1950s, groups like or centers like the Center for Ethics and Policy. And then they were later on adopted by the PLO. The founders of the PLO, Yasser Arafat and company, just by way of historical understanding, were all started out as student activists, on in Egyptian campuses. They were also very much inspired and motivated by the reality of the 1960s campuses, the Black Panthers, the Weather Underground, and other kind of revolutionary groups. Much of the founding fathers of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, were Marxists, but they liked the idea of tackling, and they saw how it worked on other universities, and they figured this could be a way to kind of layer a distinct narrative that would allow the entire cottage industry to be, basically hijacked. And it's not only in the field where I come out of. I come out of Middle East Studies by training, which I would argue is the lowest hanging fruit in many ways, or the hornet's nest in a lot of ways as it relates to Middle East studies at large, but it's really a microcosm for the humanities at large. And I would also say for what's going on, and today, the entire swatch of higher education. Um, this is part of this, as what I was saying before, as far as this, this microcosm of the academy. It's dominated by Western intellectuals, uh, by who are seeking to shape this global society, and this is exactly part of the problem. I mean, and so, framing education, in these themes of injustice, richness of history, neglecting all the real history, and by the way, that neglect that I'm talking about here when it comes to these frameworks Also has to do, to my mind, with part of the transformation where education has become much more focused on feelings rather than actual facts. We're so concerned about how our students are feeling, and making sure that we're not offending anybody. To my mind, as a professor, if I make you feel uncomfortable in a class or make you think about things, I'm doing my job to actually educate you. My job is not to validate your feelings, but actually challenge your preconceived notions about ideas, but actually make you, study and actually figure out what is going on, and to actually understand what the reality is. Case in point, if many of you have seen what took place during the hearings on Capitol Hill during, post 10/7, when you had um, three presidents of prestigious institutions going from Penn to MIT to Harvard, not one of these university presidents actually said, go back and study, go back and learn. There was much more of like a focus about feeling, and it took them also clearly an understanding to figure out that anti-Semitism, is about a context, but that's a separate issue we can go into, as far as that they couldn't figure out what was going on their campuses. But this is part of the layered narrative that is played into where scholarship and the humanities at large, have basically, have given up. And this is why I would say, if you look at the stats today, there's been a slow but sure degradation in the humanities as a result of these, how everything has been framed now, and with the entire focus, where the West and Israel, are the evergreen evils that everybody is kind of focused on, I would argue unfairly, ahistorically, and without any kind of context as relates to the Middle East. But this has become the symbolism of where this is played out, especially when it comes to Middle East studies. But I would also say this is part of the microcosm of the academy at large, as it relates to what these facts actually present, and what's playing out here. Um, Again, sticking to Middle East studies, and what we've seen here, the narrative, going back to my point about the phrases and the hijacking, the entire narrative as it relates to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has been basically codified within a binary perspective, where you have an oppressed oppressor narrative, settler colonialism. This entire understanding is, to my mind, is religiosity. I mean, there's a religious mantra here that has existed within this understanding, or and the universities, there are. There are congregants and there are preachers, when it comes to the faculty and the students themselves. And this has become the religious dominated narrative at large. And I would say that, in general, this entire transformation of the campuses in higher education, to my mind, is indeed a religious movement. And I see them in this kind of religious terms at large. And we have to, and to my mind, that's the best way to explain what has been happening and why there's been this devotion, on the one hand, to this new narrative, and on the other hand, a rejectionism of the old basic traditional religion, and not to mention, traditional environment and framework of the institutions at large and what they were about when it comes to actually talking about civics and about, Western civilization, and about talking about the great books. These are all things that are no longer, unfortunately, part of the academic zeitgeist, that students should be learning about when they go into Western liberal institutions. Parenthetically, part of in my day job, I've been working to try to reinstitute those kind of basic, important, critical elements that I think are lacking as it relates to higher education. Uh, this is, more important to go into, but let me, but I want to spend, I know that I'm stuck, I have, a few more minutes, a few more minutes left in discussing some of these issues, but I want to try to get to some of the, the low-hanging fruit that I think are critical for people to understand at large as it relates to some of these issues. Um, the hijacking that I was mentioning before is a battlefront that is extremely critical. But let me explain, how this took place in a very um, organized and a very didactic way that is important to understand at large. Beyond groups like the PLO, Arafat and company, which came to the understanding that, post 1967, that the real understanding was how do they flip the narrative? That is to argue that Jews are the Goliath and the Palestinians are the evergreen David. And that transformation or that transition was amplified by 1967 because while the historical reality of 1967 that Israel is able to triple the size of its own existence and is able to defeat the Arab world. The flip narrative that is played out on American college campuses was that Israel attacked the victim poor Palestinians and the Arab world. This is the codification or the beginning of the codification of the occupational narrative. And there were forces within higher education that allowed Palestinian narratives and Palestinian voices to come and basically ensure the fact that the narrative is flipped. Parenthetically, it's worth noting that in the 1970s to the 1980s, the highest recipients of Fulbright scholarships, American Fulbright Scholarship led by the State Department, the highest recipients of those scholarships were Palestinian scholars. They were one of the first, they were one of the, fastest growing, educational, economic environments that led for them to come to the United States and to begin to this codification that plays out here in that narrative. So what has happened, and this was amplified not only by the pedagogy, the education itself, but also by the Arab world that decided to invest millions, of dollars in higher education with the clear understanding that if one buys a chair or buys a department, one buys the politics in which these topics are being taught. Furthermore, it is also allowed for the fortification of a clear pipeline, especially within the area of Middle East studies, where the only people who are qualified or so-called qualified to teach Middle East studies are those of Arab descent and sympathetic to the Palestinian narrative. This was, of course, aggrandized, and I don't have time to go into that tonight, but is worthy of note by the late Palestinian advocate, scholar of English lit, Edward Said, who wrote his one of his famous books, Orientalism, basically codified that very narrative. But you started to see purchasing of departments and chairs. Again, starting, going back to my point about entryism, this was done a kind of a subterfuge under the radar. Nobody was paying attention. One of the first places that, had the first Middle East studies was bought by the Saudis, was the King Fahad Center at the University of Arkansas. Nobody knew about Arkansas. Nobody cared about Arkansas. It didn't matter. The fact of the matter is that became a model and a replicable model that could become a force multiplier on institutions around the United States. And so you started to see Palestinian groups setting up shops, student groups, at San Francisco State, at Berkeley. Before there was groups, that I'm sure everybody's heard today about Students for Justice in Palestine, and there's also a Faculty for Justice in Palestine. But before those groups came about in the 70s and 80s, there was a group known as GUPS, the General Union for Palestine Students. Those individuals later on became faculty. And they're the ones who are ensuring the fact, and they're protecting, they're the gatekeepers and ensuring the fact that their students and the people that are coming into those gateways are only of one political and one persuasion, and to ensure the fact that there is really no discourse and no debate about any of these issues. And so that's part of how that architecture played out. And this is all part of the foundation building that led to the buildup that we saw on 10/7, which is again 100%, critical and clear. This was, again, was amplified in the 1960s by the growth of scholar activists, where individuals decided to give up their scholarship in replacement in lieu of activism. So going on to the Quad and calling for death to Israel, and Israel is an apartheid state, and in genocidal terms and whatnot. This is a beginning of political indoctrination and political activism that has hijacked these campuses, and this is where the seeds that led to the reality of 10/7, where you had faculty who are walking around with pride and zeal and supporting terrorist groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and going around with pride and zeal under the guise of so-called scholarship, teaching and supporting terrorism and the support terrorist groups to their students. And this is part of what we saw as far as the entire theatrics and fanfare that existed on 10/7, where you had faculty members saying that they were exhilarated, that how awesome this was. This is all part of that narrative at large. Um, Let me just explain one more thing here, and which is critical, as far as the terrorism aspect. And I know that I have 2 more minutes to finish up before we go into Q&A, and then we can maybe go into some of this as well. Um, the largest one of the frameworks for this narrative are critical at large, and really go back to my earlier point about the hijacking and about agents of soft power that have been hijacked by terrorist organizations to create a distinct narrative, but really with the sole goal of what everything I've been describing to you tonight as winning the hearts and minds. Winning the hearts and minds is really how you shape the identity and how allowed all of this to happen and to become full force. Um, Up until 9/11, that we are about to celebrate, as I said, the 25th anniversary of 9/11, American foreign policy was focused on state-sponsored terrorism. So they would go after state-sponsored terrorist groups, and they ignored um, naively, something that we learned, the hard way after 9/11, that there are charity organizations that were able to infiltrate themselves into the United States and to funnel money to create a distinct narrative. One of those charities was known as the Holy Land Foundation. The Holy Land Five, if you go back just parenthetically to, the current mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani, when he was a rapper, he talks about the Holy Land Five, the people that are currently in jail as far as Holy Land Foundation. These are all individuals that were connected to Hamas. This goes back, they were designated post 9/11, and this is all part of how they started operating. Let me just be clear here, and look, and if you just to kind of point out the dates here that are no coincidence. Holy Land was formed in 1988. It's the same year that Hamas was formed also, and Hamas starts setting up shop in Gaza in 87. By 88, they are already full-fledged organization. And by 1993, they are already conducting meetings in the United States, namely in Philadelphia, and where they started talking about how to use charities to infiltrate them to raise money for Hamas and how to use institutions like higher education, like charities, like mosques to raise money for all of this. And so this evolution of these current four groups here that I think are worthy of note, from Holy Land to IAP, the Islamic Association for Palestine, to Kind Hearts, to AMP. AMP today, the American Muslims for Palestine, is the sponsoring group for the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. And SJP is the largest springboard for Palestinian activism slash terrorism. And these groups all have direct ties to Hamas and terrorist organizations at large. And they've been operating in a way where they are, those of you who are, CPAs and lawyers, SJP is not necessarily a 501c3. They've been able to use fiscal trustees to try to infiltrate the money. And what has happened that their partner in layering this ideology and this indoctrination are the universities. American universities do not say no to money. And this is, part of the other part of the problem that we're talking about today, as far as reform in higher education. The what I consider to be, in higher education, and what I call the industrial academic complex, where these universities will take money from anybody unless they're called on the sources of the money. So universities have accepted money from Saudis, from not to mention Qatar. Qatar has invested since 2014 billions of dollars in American institutions, buying campuses, having campuses abroad. We know today from Discovery that they mandate and have infiltrated also the hiring and firing practices. If you're not sympathetic to Hamas, you're not going to get a job or you're not going to get the money from these Qataris. And so there's a whole architecture that is layered to create this distinct narrative. The perception that Qatar and sympathizers of Hamas have is that the American university is up for sale and they're buying a brand. And they have done this very successfully and very well. I mean, just case in point, up until 9/11, there was a proposed on the books Osama, and not Osama, a bin Laden chair that was, by one of the bin Laden brothers at Harvard University. And so this is, what has allowed this layering to take place here. And so when you talk about reform in higher education, when I talk about reform in higher education and what is needed, one of the first steps that needs to happen is really cracking down on several things. One, foreign students that are coming in with ideologies and their backgrounds. Nobody asks anybody when they come into if you're coming from a foreign student, were you ever a member of, or are you currently a member of a foreign terrorist organization? Background checks, to my mind, are important. And it's not only happening at the student level, it's also happening at the faculty level. One of the most important committees in higher education is the Committee for Tenure and Promotion. One should ask the question as far as where these faculty are coming from before we have these tenure radicals, which have been permanent fixtures in higher education. So background checks are critical and looking at where these monies are coming from. Second, no less important, violations of FARA. If countries are giving money to institutions, one should question where these monies are coming from and should they be registered as a foreign agent. And by the way, this money that's coming into our institutions is not only Middle Eastern studies monies, not only Middle East countries, it's also coming from Russia and from China. So, I mean, again, not allies of the United States, but the perception is that the university, which is shapes the identity and the future leadership of of American leaders, is, this is where they know they're investing their dollars and money, and they have a lot to spend to actually shape these identities. The universities we need to resist this. We need to look at, what needs to be framed here. We need to understand what nefarious forces are acting here. We need to take back the universities, and we need to have transparency and accountability when it comes to what the institutions are actually doing. And we need to do a deep dive into the individuals who are teaching these classes. We need to look at, in general, I would say that only in higher education, the tenure system, to my mind, is also questionable, that you get tenure and you're tenured for life, even though you're spouting at times a lot of nonsensical information. Like in every other area in the world, people should be promoted based on actual productivity and deliverables, and not ingrained into a system. Not to mention the fact that I would argue also from a financial standpoint, the endowments need to be taxed. Universities need to have, they are not. They are not, there should be some kind of accountability as far as what the institutions are actually doing and what they're actually producing. So for the betterment of our students, for the betterment of American society, and ensuring the fact that the universities themselves are actually doing what they were actually supposed to do, rather than producing these tenured radical ideologies that have become basically a cottage industry for supporting far radical ideas that are anti-American and anti-Western, and promoting terrorism. And so all of that are the things that I believe need to happen to change. And I know I went a little bit over time, but let me stop here and let me try to answer some questions along the way, and I'll turn it back to you, Audrey.
Thank you. Thank you, Asaf. So there are a number of questions. Number of questions. Uh, so you've laid out pretty dramatically the problem. Um, what is the motivation? What is the bottom line? What do people, if all these things happen and they get their way, what, where do we wind up? What is the end goal here?
Well, there are several end goals here. I mean, what I've laid out here tonight is what I'm observing as the problem. I mean, I think that we have had our blinders on. This has been the long march on higher education has been happening for decades, as I've described tonight, or given a semblance of the problem. Uh, the American Jewish community has been behind the eight ball. We have not, the rise, and a lot of what I've laid out tonight has also been part of the backdrop for the normalizing of anti-Semitism in American society. I say this, you know, it's not, it's important to understand, um, Jews and Catholics have invested the most amount of capital in higher education, and they're the ones who are being turned on. I say this tongue in cheek, but I think it's important just to kind of illustrate my point. We may have bought the buildings, but the opposition has bought the education. From a cost benefit analysis, they've done a much better job. And the proof is within 10/7, the rise of the BDS movement. Their goal is to basically, as I said, to turn American institutions, American democratic institutions, on their heads. There is a larger goal here, to my mind. If I were to be, a bit more blunt and aggressive here, there is an attempt to Islamize Western society and American society by using American institutions. As I don't, to my mind, whatever happens in the academy never ends in the academy. This is a dimension of a larger cultural problem that infiltrated. And if we understand what the problem is, I think that we need to find solid solutions to deal with the problem here. Because from their perspective, just to be clear, the victory, the election of Zoran Mamdani is exactly a poster child of a success story. Ilhan Omar. I mean, there is a politicization. And by the way, just to be fair here, the shoehorn kind of narrative, it's in the far right and the far left, converge. It's not only coming, it's coming from both ends here. And this isolationist narrative and this hatred is part of the larger goal here. And so going back to basics and trying to safeguard our own institutions and American society should be the goal.
Um, so, right. So we're seeing the rise of the Social Democratic Party. take over in our big cities. So this is all part of the same tactic. Um, David asks, what are some of the groups that are combating this? And are there non-Jewish groups that are combating this?
Um, there are a lot of groups out there who have realized, that this is happening. I mean, I think that everybody's realized that there is a problem. Um, there are, first of all, okay, so in my unbiased opinion, the two organizations that I head, SPME and ESMIA, are two faculty organizations that have created, an alternative viewpoint. ESMIA was founded by the two giants, in my mind, that we won't see in our lifetime. I think again, Professor Bernard Lewis and Professor Fouad Ajami, about the trajectory of Middle East studies. So ideologically and scholarly wise, trying to create an alternative to the echo chamber in Mesa, which is the Middle East Studies Association in America. There are a lot of groups out there that are now engaged in exposing terrorist money that's coming to the United States, Qatari money that is working on some of these things. Groups like Navi are involved in K through 12 education, trying to expose what's happening as far as looking at some of the tainted money that's coming in to hijack K through 12. There are think tanks in Washington that are exposing some of these groups. This is not to, let's to be clear here. I think that Jews are on the front line, but this is not a Jewish problem. This is an American problem. I mean, and to my mind, this is a Western societal problem that's infiltrating American institutions. And so anti-Semitism is a dimension of that, but it's not the only thing. And so, exposing and dealing with these issues, putting university presidents on Capitol Hill, I think is a critical thing to spotlight the rot. There's a lot of work that's being done currently in the lawfare space, that is adjudicating a lot of these issues and going after groups like AMP and SJP, especially victims of 10/7. We know today, I mean, let me be blunt and honest about it. The connection between the hijackers, who took hostages in Gaza and the encampments at Columbia. I mean, so you have evidence of material support for terrorism. And so there is a bunch of lawsuits that are currently happening today, that the victims of 10/7 are going after. Those are all positive things that need to be exposed more.
There's some questions about the relationship between this and the question of Palestinian rights. Where is the divergence and where is the confluence? And if there is a Palestinian state, or is that actually the goal at all? Um,
Well, so let me be clear here. These Islamist organizations are not calling for a two-state solution. They're not calling for peace between, Israel and its neighbors. The BDS movement never called for that. I mean, all of these groups are calling for the maximalist demands, where the demand is from the river to the sea. I mean, they're saying it to you, globalizing intifada. I mean, intifada, you don't need, we have ample evidence of how these words, going back to the earlier parts of my comments tonight, have been weaponized. From the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh to killing, staffers at the Israeli embassy. I mean, these words have meanings, in contrast to, what Zoran Mamdani and the like would like you to believe. So none of this is about a two-state solution. It's about the eradication and about the marginalization of Jews at large from American society. And so if Palestinian rights were about a two-state solution and trying to find a third wave and more moderates, we can talk about that. But these groups here that have infiltrated, they're, as I said, and I'll say it again, their perspective is entirely binary. And the binary perspective is basically that Jews have no right at all. And they're trying to ostracize and to remove Jews from the same spaces where we have worked for decades to be part of. And so that's where the another part of the hijacking and the normalizing of anti-Semitism has taken, become front and center ideology.
So yeah, I think this is confusing to a lot of young people who are focused on Palestinian rights and don't associate the global destruction of Western civilization with the messaging of how can we do this to the Palestinians? And so I think there's massive confusion about what the intent of these groups are. And somebody, for example, asked, how come all these encampments they all had so much in common, so quickly put up after 10/7? Who was funding it and what was behind that?
Right. So let me be clear. I'll take it one step further. The organizational narrative to all of this was put forth. I mean, that we have today the toolkits that SJP had on 10/8 and on 10/9. The fact that this was an integral part of the Hamas battlefront. Hamas has a magnificent PR apparatus, social media, where they were able to activate individuals, and to have toolkits of how to activate the campus, the connections between the encampments and the people on the ground. It was no coincidence that all the tents were the same color while they were still, while students were still asking for their, vegan, pizzas and whatever, that they needed to have, and their Ubers and whatnot. Those, by the way, were all funded by George Soros. The Soros Foundation funded all of those activities. The groups that were funding, and this is, by the way, I devoted an entire chapter into my latest book called The Political Economics of Anti-Semitism. You had a convergence, to your point, Audrey, of the red, green, and brown alliance, the people that were involved in Occupy Wall Street, the people that were involved, individuals, which of late there's been a massive exposure and a lot of write-ups on individuals like Fergie Chambers, who's a communist in Singapore, who's married to Jody Evans, who is the founder of Code Pink. And so these groups have all come together. The Brown, Green, and Red Alliance, brown being the Nazis, the green being the socialist, and the red, and the green being the Islamists, and the red being the socialists, all coming together under their larger hatred and animosity towards Israel. And they used different fiscal trustees to funnel money, groups like Westpac. AMP, as I mentioned here, is a sponsor of the SJP. They have conferences, they've motivated individuals. This was a coordinated effort. None of this, and let me be, and I'll be 100% blunt about this. 10/7 did not come in a vacuum. This entire architecture that I'm describing tonight, or giving a kind of a sample of what we saw here, was an organized, orchestrated foundation building that Hamas was aware of, Hamas utilized, and they knew exactly what points to press. When you actually have Hamas leadership going on Al Jazeera TV and other Hamas outlets thanking American students for their support of the resistance for the cause. No coincidence at all. And so it should be clear here that those of us, even, people like myself who've been in the weeds for decades, we've seen all the signs, but to understand the depth of how all of this was coordinated, funded, and manufactured is what exactly led that produced a 10/7.
So how much do you think the students understand of all of this? Your average student at Columbia in an encampment, how much do you think they understand? And what would you do to help them understand what the bigger picture is here?
I think that some of them were pawns, some of them were swept by the kind of wave of resistance. Everybody wants to have their own 1968 Chicago and kind of jumping on, and protesting and whatnot. But the difference between our students, or when I'm saying, the American Jewish students that go to campus, you get it, as far if the universities are still a symbol of American meritocracy, you go to campus, you get an education, you get a job. The professional apparatchiks by the Palestinian groups are professional students. They spend decades on campus, and graduate students, PhD candidates, with the sole goal of mobilizing students. And even if you look at some of the cases today of Khalil Muhammad and other people, and how many years they've spent on the campuses organizing and mobilizing and motivating, and have gone unnoticed. They came with a very clear agenda. And by the way, it's also these foundations and that I'm talking about, these students were paid, in the tone of up to 60 or 50K, so you could become a professional apparatchik and getting, monies that were being, to basically do this kind of activism. And, at a moment's notice, they're ready to like spark the right, flare, and they take it, and they take it beyond. And that's what they did. Some of them, they're, to your first point, some of them realized eventually, and there was a few that, again, we have there are a few articles that came out later that they, realized how dishonest the movement was and started to wake up about the reality of how the university was hijacked or whatnot. But again, students were very much, they were sponges and they were inspired and they got, there were professors out there and they all, this kind of hijacking of the larger narrative, and they jumped on the bandwagon.
Um, so yeah. So how much do you think young people just wanting to be aspirational and having a mission and a aspirational kind of vision of what kind of world they'd like to see, um, how much do you think is I mean, why is this serious? Let me ask you that. Why is this serious, and why should we be alarmed? What are the ramifications of this? That so they're in the college campuses, so they're protesting. They'll grow up. They'll why is this important, and why should we have the alarm bells on now?
This is serious because this is Hamas in America. Let me start with that. Let me be 100% abundantly clear here. This is terrorism, in American Islamism and, the Muslim Brotherhood in American society taking over our institutions. There has been an indoctrination of terrorism. There has been an infiltration of terrorism under the guise of scholarship or so-called scholarship. And to your earlier point, under the so-called political aspirations of Palestinianism. Palestinianism is a religiosity in American college campuses. And so within the hierarchy, of what is known as intersectionality, the idea of supporting the underdog cause. The gold standard of underdog causes is the Palestinian narrative. So if you support any underdog cause in the world, any progressive liberal cause in the world, you must support the Palestinian narrative. Whether or not they are connected, whether or not there's data to prove that, it doesn't matter. It's all about the impression management and the kind of these trigger words. And so you have, which is where, unfortunately, Jewish students who are inspired by the environment and want to be part of progressive circles, the conundrum that they face is that they are forced to choose. They're forced to choose if you want to be part of a progressive, liberal, LGBTQ, human rights club or whatever it wants to be, and then being a Zionist. Because if you're a Zionist, the immediate connotation is that you're a racist. And Zionism is racism. Not only that, I would argue that today Zionism is perceived as Nazism. Jews are Nazis. And so nobody wants to be called a racist. Nobody wants to be a Nazi. So they basically are said, you have to shed the one element in your identity that makes you a horrible racist person, that is Zionism. And so there are different kind of manifestations of, I'm Jewish, or I'm a cultural Jew, I'm a humanist Jew, because Zionism makes me feel guilty about who I am. So they have to rid themselves of that ideology. What I would argue that part of what we need to be working on is reinforcing or reinvigorating Zionism, to my mind, is about renewal. We need to find a Zionism that coincides with American society of 2026, not the one of 48, 67, 82, 73. I mean, we have to talk about Zionism today. And so these are the things that we need to work on. I mean, it was the late, Louis Brandeis, talked about the fact that there's no conflict. Actually, it was synonymous to having American values and Jewish values and Zionist values and supporting the state. We have to find those kind of similar anchors, but rooted in an environment of a 2026 that is driven by social media, AI, and whatnot. And we have to use these tools in order to invigorate and help understand a reality that we instill Jewish pride in Zionism today, which is part of our challenge, to my mind.
I know it's not the purview of your work, but we are seeing the silencing of Jewish voices in the publishing companies. We are seeing the silencing of Jewish doctors and researchers not getting appointments in universities, Israeli doctors not getting fellowships. And so this is pervasive within American culture, even beyond, and maybe stemming from the academia, maybe going out into going into the business world, going into the publishing world, going into the medical field, going, into the entertainment industry.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it's all over the place. We saw it in Hollywood. We saw it at the Oscars. I mean, the pro-Palestinianism. We see it all over the place. I mean, I will say to your point, which is worthy of note, some of the encampment leaders were, there was a growth in law schools, and some of them, so corporate America rescinded some of those law offers, as a result of that. I mean, we saw at the beginning of the war, at 10/7, you had nurses at Langoon who said, "Don't send me Jews because I'm going to stab them." I mean, this is pervasive. This is not limited, let me be clear, to the humanities. I mean, I focus tonight as a case study on Middle East studies and the humanities because I think it's, one of the hornet's nest. But this, to my mind, and I said this at the beginning, but I'll say it again, the entire swatch of the university, the blanket has become a blanket kind of springboard of Palestinian activism at large. And this is the one thing that people rally around in this narrative. And that's why I was saying before, this is religiosity. And we're fighting a religious indoctrination here that is created and is using the very institutions that should be promoting diversity, integrity, um, research. That's not what is happening. And so, if the university cannot um, have actual intellectual honesty and exchange of, inquiry and whatnot, then what makes us the American liberal university different than a madrasa in Tehran or anywhere else where indoctrination is dominating? I mean, we have to be concerned about those issues as well.
okay, in the moment we have left, is there anything, you've said a lot to us. You said an awful lot to us tonight. Is there anything that you haven't said that you would like to leave us with?
Speak out. I mean, this is where, the power is very important. The first line of giving for most Americans is their alma maters. And because, grandparents and parents want to send their kids to where they got their education. That's no longer indeed maybe the case and or the institution that they went to, but they need to speak out. This is, we need to get on. A lot of this indoctrination is taking place on the local level, school boards. If we don't speak up, if we let others speak for us, then nothing is going to change. So we need to speak out, speak to our elected officials. This is an endemic problem. We have the information, we have the data, we have the evidence, but people need to take that and to actually speak out and advocate on these behalf.
Okay. Thank you. You've shared so much with us, and there were so many more questions we didn't get to, which we will send to you, Asaf. And thank you again for such a spirited and such an informative lecture. So all of you, our next, and you will get the recording. All of you on the call here will get the recording within a week, and Asaf will be getting your questions as well. Um,
Thank you so much for the hospitality. I appreciate that.
okay. So our next Scholar Circle lecture will feature Avi Melamed on regional voices often missing from Western conversations. And this will be on Thursday, August the 13th. It'll be an afternoon lecture at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register at joinscholarscircle.org for that lecture. This should be a very, very interesting lecture. There's a lot of information that we miss because we see things in translation. And Avi is an expert at giving us the message behind the words. So please join us for that. Again, it'll be on August the 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can register at Join Scholar Circle. And please consider a donation to Scholar Circle. You can do that on our Chai Mitzvah website. So we would appreciate that so we can keep these lectures going free of charge for you. And we'll see you hopefully on the 13th of August. Good night, everyone.